Ready? Okay. So I love the incredible diversity of saints, and especially looking at female saints and seeing that there isn't any particular way that you have to be holy, any particular way you have to dress, any particular way that you have to, what's going on now? Any particular way that you have to act. So I think I told you guys about Blessed Maria Troncati. Did I tell you about her? She was a Salesian sister founded by St. John Bosco in early 20th century Italy. She was a battlefield nurse in World War I. And then after World War I was over, she sailed for Ecuador and she became an evangelist in the jungles of Ecuador. But when she first got there was this woman who had been shot and her father was the chieftain. So she got to this village and the chief was like, if you can't save her, I'll kill you. So she performs jungle surgery with a knife to her throat. She's miraculously successful, spends the next 40 years traveling the jungle of Ecuador, encountering indigenous peoples who'd never heard the gospel before and evangelizing them until she died in a plane crash when she was on her way to a retreat when she was 62. So she was a battlefield nurse, jungle surgeon, evangelist nun. Just in case you were buying into the lie that the Catholic Church hates women and is always trying to hold us back, right? It's like, you want to have all the vocations, have all the vocations, right? Sequentially probably. We've got all kinds of saints who were wives and mothers and nuns. But the saint that I've been learning about today is Venerable Teresita Quevedo. And Teresita, we're going to pass her picture around because she's movie star pretty. She's so pretty. She was a mess of a child. She threw tantrums all the time. They called her Little Poison, Venenito, Little Poison. And she would scream. She would refuse to eat all kinds of things. And her family practically despaired. And then when she was making her first communion, she decided that she was going to make a sacrifice and that every time someone offered her something to eat that she didn't want, or every time that she was angry and she wanted to scream, she would offer that as a gift to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she would be good and kind instead. And she really started to grow in holiness. And she's from a pretty legit family. 3 of her uncles were martyrs. No big deal in the Spanish Civil War. And she, when she was 10, she went on retreat. And she wrote in her journal, I have decided to become a saint. And then when she was 13, she entered the Sodality of Mary. And she took as her motto, Mother, when people look at me, may they see you. And you're like, oh, she's one of those saints who was bad and then became perfect. But she was also voted best dressed in her high school senior class. She was captain of the basketball team. She was a tennis star. She loved going to bullfights. Anytime there was a party, she was at the party. She was like the heart of the social circle of this high school. And she was always getting into trouble, little things, they weren't allowed to just be idle. They had to be doing things. Do you want to show the camera what she looks like? Are we clever like that? There, isn't she pretty?
Yeah, there we go.
They weren't allowed just to sit around. They had to be working on something. But one time she was sitting with her cousin, and she was embroidering, and her cousin wasn't doing anything, and they heard the sisters coming in their school, and she was working on a tablecloth, and she just threw her cousin underneath the table and put the tablecloth over top, and was just like, hello, sister, I'm just embroidering and praying, don't mind me. And she would get her friends to do her homework for her, and she was just ordinary and fun and normal. And then when she was 17, she was a senior in high school, and she really felt like God was calling her to religious life. So she went to the Carmelites. They were active Carmelites. And they had been the ones who taught her. And she went to Mother Superior, and she was like, Mother, I want to be a Carmelite, and I want to go to China. Will you send me to China? And the Superior was like, why don't you first be a novice, and after that we can talk about China. But she was just sees life by the horns, just this wild, amazing girl. She drove a car, which is the 1940s, so that's kind of a big thing for a woman to be driving a car. But apparently it made her father crazy because she drove too fast, and he thought that it was unsafe that she was always driving too fast. So she went to her family and she told them she was entering the convent, and they were sad, but they were supportive. And she entered, and on the day that she received the habit, she made a vow that she would never willingly commit a venial sin. What? Yeah. And there she is in the convent, but she's this big extrovert who loves going to bullfights and loves dancing and loves wearing pretty clothes. And it was so hard for her. the whole time she was like working to be in silence and to spend time in prayer. And she became this beautiful religious sister. But only a year and a half after she entered, it was Advent of 1949. And in 1950, the Pope proclaimed Mary's Assumption ex cathedra. And so she was talking with the sisters in 1949, and she was like, don't you think that the celebration in heaven is going to be amazing when Mary's Assumption is proclaimed? And they were like, oh yeah, it's going to be amazing. She was like, I'm going to be there. And everyone was like, what? I mean, she's like 19 years old, right? She was like, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be in heaven. I think God's going to give me this grace. I think Mary loves me so much that she's going to bring me home to heaven so that I can celebrate her Assumption up there. And it's going to be amazing. And everyone was like, girl, you're like 19-year-old tennis star. Like, you're fine. And then a month later, she started to feel sick, and her father was a doctor, and he came in to examine her and discovered that she had a type of meningitis, and he knew it was going to be fatal. And his heart broke to lose his daughter, but mostly for her, because he knew that she loved being a Carmelite. And if she was terminally ill, she hadn't taken vows yet. And so if you're like really, really sick, they ask you to leave. If you have taken vows, obviously, like, that's your home and you stay there. But he was like, okay, I'm going to beg Mother Superior to let her stay. And so he went to Mother Superior and he like explained what her illness was, explained that she was dying. And Mother Superior said, oh, I know it's so selfish of me, but please, would you let her stay here? Please, would you let her die here? She's been such a gift to us. Please don't take her home. And he was like, I was going to ask you the same thing. So she spends the next 3 months dying in this like terribly painful way. She had to get spinal taps. She had 64 spinal taps to relieve the pressure on her brain. And she asked to have them without anesthesia so that she could be united to the suffering of Christ. And on Holy Saturday, her last words were, oh, Mother, how beautiful you are. How beautiful you are, Mother. And Mary brought her home. And at 20 years old, she died and is going to be a saint on the strength of she was really fun and tried real hard. Which I just think is incredible. I mean, she's no great mystic. Like, the spinal taps thing, like, that's a big deal. But, like, generally speaking, she's just, like, a lovely woman. And that's what holiness looked like for her. And then there's my friend Margaret of Castello, who was a blind, lame, hunchback dwarf. And that's what holiness looked like for her. You know? And Maria Troncati, who was a jungle evangelist. And that's what holiness looked like for her. And I told you all about Blessed Cecilia, right? Or Blessed Diana and the convent and her family dragging her out, kicking and screaming and breaking her ribs. Apparently that's what holiness looked like for her, right? Or Saint Hyacintha, who was the mean girl and the backslider and the wearing the fancy habit. That's what holiness looked like, or, you know, that's what the path to holiness looked like for her anyway. I just, you know, we were talking a little bit about the Marian virtues today, and we're not really going to get into those because I feel like that's not what the Lord's asking us to talk about. But I want to look at Mary as an image of holiness. Because, I mean, obviously, that's like, she's the perfect woman. She's the perfect image of holiness. But I think that's something that is poorly expressed sometimes. Because we get this idea that Mary was, you know, meek and mild, right? And maybe she was meek and mild, but that doesn't mean she was like this all the time. In fact, so Scripture doesn't give us a lot about the personality of Mary. Mary is a very, very blank in Scripture. So that we don't begin to think that this is what a holy personality looks like. Someone asked me one time in deep despair, she said, do you think the Virgin Mary ever yelled? And I said, all the time. And she was like, what? And I said, mothers yelling is not sinful. Like, did she need to yell at Jesus because he was bad? No, absolutely not. Did she need to yell at little Jeremiah who was running out in front of a horse that was coming down the street? Absolutely she did. Absolutely she needed to yell. You know, like, would her yelling and my yelling sound the same? I don't know, because that's not the point, right? We're left without any understanding of what Mary's personality was like because God doesn't want to canonize a particular personality. He wants to canonize a wholehearted pursuit of Christ. And so we look at Mary, and what do we see about her? We see Mary saying yes. The angel comes, the angel says, you're going to bear God's son. And Mary says, let it be done to me according to your word. What is she saying yes to there? Well, she doesn't really know. But she knows who she's saying yes to. And that's all she needs. Does that mean that Mary didn't question and wonder and try and plan and try and control and try and figure things out? Well, we don't actually know. All we know is that she said yes. We know that when she saw these truths of the faith that were being revealed to her, what's her reaction? When Jesus is lost in Jerusalem and she finds him, what did Mary do in her heart? That's the Bible, I know. She pondered these things in her heart, right? So we know she's a woman who says yes to God. We know she's a woman of deep prayer and contemplation. Do you have to be a quiet person to be a woman of deep prayer and contemplation? You do not. I hope not. I would be really out of luck. We also know she was a mom. Have you ever watched a brand new mom with her brand new baby and watched her stare at every little wrinkle in his fingers and gaze at his skinny little baby chicken legs? And look into his eyes like they are the first perfectly formed eyes the world has ever seen? What if we looked at Jesus the way Mary looks at Jesus? And when he was a grown man and he would come home to her house and he would sleep there, exhausted from pouring himself out, that she would walk into his room and she would just stare at him. What if we kept our eyes on him the way Mary keeps her eyes on Jesus? What's the last thing we hear from Mary? Do y'all remember? Jesus' first miracle. The wedding feast at Cana. And Mary goes and she intercedes. She says, they have no wine. And he says, how does your concern affect me? What is it to me and you? He's asking her there. He says, my hour has not yet come. What he's saying to her is, if I start this, it ends at Calvary. Are you ready? Are you ready to say goodbye? Because my hour hasn't come yet. And she's a woman of the cross. And she says yes to that suffering for love of him. And she says, do whatever he tells you. Those are the last words of the Virgin Mary in Scripture. Do whatever he tells you. Are these things people can say about you? That you say yes to God? That you're a woman of prayer? That you direct other people to do what he says? Because that's what we're aiming for. I've read books that are like, you need to wear clothes that the Virgin Mary would wear. And I'm like, ain't nobody got no long baby blue robes here, okay? I don't know. You really want me to put on that veil and a crown? Because I'll wear a crown. I will. I think I can rock that. But the point isn't to force ourselves into a mold that the world has described around Mary, but to look at who she actually is. And this, I think, is fascinating. So if you brought your Bibles. In Luke 1, right, we looked at this last week at the visitation. But Mary goes to Elizabeth. Elizabeth hears Mary's greeting and cries out, most blessed are you among women. Does anybody remember who I told you last week? That there are two women who are told, blessed are you among women in the Old Testament. Anybody remember? One of them's a Catholic bonus feature. Not Ruth. I heard Judith. And the other one you're probably not going to remember, Jael. I don't actually know how you say that. But we're going with Jael for today. Jael would be easier. But it doesn't sound as Catholic. It sounds more Baptist. Jael. So Jael is a woman who appears only once for a paragraph in Scripture. In the book of Judges, chapter 5. And it's interesting because there was this guy, and like God told him what to do, and he was afraid to do it, and so he refused. And the Lord said to him, "Okay, but because you have refused, the salvation is going to come through the hand of a woman, and not through you." Which is like, to his mind, great shame. And God was like, "Yeah, well, salvation is going to come through a hand of a woman. That's kind of the plan anyway." So there's this general Sisera. He's running away. Chapter 4, Judges 4, verse 17. Sisera, in the meantime, had fled on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of the Kenite Heber, blah, blah, blah. She went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in with me. Do not be afraid." So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. He said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink. I'm thirsty." But she opened a jug of milk for him to drink and then covered him over. Stand at the entrance to the tent. If anyone comes and asks, "Is there someone here?" say no. Instead, you don't just get to tell women what to do all the time for all of history, right? Instead, Jael, wife of Heber, got a tent peg and took a mallet in her hand. While Sisera was sound asleep, she stealthily approached him and drove the peg through his temple down into the ground so that he perished in death. Yeah. She impaled him in the skull. So this is the bad guy, right? This is the guy who's attacking Israel, who's trying to destroy them. And God empowers her, inspires her to be a warrior. And the response to her saving Israel from evil and death by attacking this man is she's told, "Blessed are you among women." The other time that we hear that is Judith. And y'all know Judith, right? At least a little bit. So the book of Judith is fantastic. It's one of the ones Catholics have, Protestants don't, and so we should really appreciate it. Judith is like the Mulan of the Bible. So Judith is beautiful. Like, oh my goodness, drop dead gorgeous. She's a widow. And the Jews are being persecuted. There's this army that's coming after them, and all the dudes are like, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We don't know what to do." So they go to Judith, which is crazy, right? That they like go and find this widow, and they're like, "You're amazing and beautiful and also brilliant, so like, what do you think?" Right? So hang on. There she is. She's between Tobit and Esther. And Judith says, "Give me a second." So she goes back into her room. She puts on her smoky eye. She puts on her cutest outfit. And she walks down the hill. She prays, right? And it's beautiful because she prays, and it says, as soon as Judith had thus concluded, she rose from the ground. She called her maid, and they went down into the house, took off the garments, laid aside the garments of her widowhood, anointed her body with ointment, arranged her hair, bound it with a fillet, put on festive attire. I mean, this girl, she's getting dolled up, right? Let me read to you, though, the prayer that she prayed first. She says to the Lord, "Your strength is not in numbers, nor does your power depend upon stalwart men, but you are the God of the lowly, the helper of the oppressed, the supporter of the weak, the protector of the forsaken, the savior of those without hope. Please, please, God of my forefather, God of the heritage of Israel, Lord of heaven and earth, creator of the waters, king of all you have created, hear my prayer." That's a powerful prayer, right? And she has asked the Lord, crush their pride by the hand of a woman. Does that sound reminiscent of anything to you? A woman crushing the enemy? Do you hear Genesis 3 in that? Where God says to the woman about her offspring, he said, about the devil, he says, "You will strike at his head." And so here we have Judith striking at the head of the enemy. Gets herself all dolled up. She goes down into the camp of the opposing army. And she's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm like really scared." And the general Holofernes is like, "I'll help you, little lady." And she's like, "Oh my gosh, I like really don't know what to do." And he's like, "You just come in here, I'll take good care of you." And she's like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Have a drink, and another drink, and 6 more drinks. Baby, why don't you lie down and take a nap?" She pulls her machete out of her bag, and she chops off his head. She puts his head back in her bag and walks back up to the village. or the city. And they're like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And she was like, here's his head. And they're like, ew, what are we supposed to do with that? And she's like, you put it on a pike, and you put it on the wall, and tomorrow morning you run down in the camp and you attack them. They don't have their general, they run away. I've got things to do. And she like, pieces. Right? I mean, right, the Mulan of the Bible, right? Because this is a woman who knows that her strength lies in her beauty and also in her machete-wielding right arm, right? If for Jael, her strength was in her hospitality and also in her tent peg and mallet. You know, and I'm not saying like go out and chop off bad guys' heads. Like this is not like the backstory to a new female superhero. But Judith, the response to Judith is the same. In Judith 13:18, after she comes back with the head and they deal with that, they say, blessed are you above all the women on earth. So when Luke writes this, blessed are you among women, either he or Elizabeth or the Holy Spirit, or maybe the Holy Spirit through him or Elizabeth, is deliberately evoking these two women and saying to the Blessed Virgin Mary, who we see as this like dull plaster, placidly smiling thing, saying, you are a warrior queen who will attack and defeat the enemy. That's also kind of a Marian virtue. And, you know, and we obviously know that Genesis 3 is talking about how Jesus is going to defeat the devil, and he comes through Mary. Mary is not the one who with her own hands is defeating the devil, but it's through the fruit of her womb the devil is defeated. And yet, what we're told here is that Mary is the new Jael, the new Judith, the new warrior queen. You don't have to be a fading violet to be a Catholic woman. You don't have to be dull, flavorless, quiet to be like the Blessed Virgin Mary. But you can be. Because to be a warrior as a woman does not necessarily involve a machete. Right? Mary is a prayer warrior. Mary is a warrior in defense of the souls of her children. Mary is a warrior in preaching the good news. As women, we fight in a lot of ways. But we need to be looking to Mary to ask, what battle am I supposed to be fighting? She says, do whatever he tells you. Right? So Mary's the one who's saying, let me draw you closer to my son. Let me show you what holiness looks like for you. But I just feel like it's this incredibly broad thing for us. And so many of the choices that we make as women, they're spurred on not by our desire for holiness, but by our conviction that we are inadequate. Our certainty that we are not enough. And, you know, we've talked about this the last 2 weeks. The way that we look to other people to define us, especially to men or boys. Some of you are old enough that you should be looking for men, but mostly what you find is boys, right? Some of you aren't old enough yet for men, in which case you just really shouldn't bother with boys at all, right? Okay, we'll get there. What the distinction I'm trying to draw is not like people who can grow beards versus people who can't grow beards. The distinction I'm trying to draw is between men who are willing to sacrifice for love of women, whether or not those women are going to offer anything in return, and boys who are far more interested in themselves than they are in sacrificial love. The latter are not worth your time, but ladies, we spend a lot of time with those, don't we? We spend a lot of time because we need the attention, because we're afraid that nobody's going to love us, because it's fun, because they're cute, because the prom's coming up and like you got to have a date to prom. Like, I don't know. All kinds of different reasons. But I think so often we get this idea that it's okay for us to date someone, I shouldn't use the word worthless about a human being. But you know what I'm going for here. To date someone who uses us. To date someone who doesn't respect us. To date someone who isn't willing to make sacrifices for us. Because, he'll get better. I see like the real good inside of him. You know? Okay, ladies, let me just tell you. If your friends don't like him, and your family doesn't like him, and his friends don't like him, and his family doesn't like him, he's not secretly a good guy and you're the only one who's figured that out. He's just a jerk, right? And it's not your job to make him not a jerk. This is something that drives me crazy about Pride and Prejudice. Ladies, I love me some Jane Austen, okay, and I'll watch the BBC version on repeat. I understand, like, this is great literature, this is great film, but everybody's read or seen Pride and Prejudice, right? We at least know the story somewhat. Okay, well, Mr. Darcy is a jerk, and he's arrogant, and he thinks that he is awesome, and that he thinks that Elizabeth Bennet is not worth his time, and he is disdainful of her, and he's rude to her, and then he falls in love with her because she's real pretty, so he's like still rude and disdainful, and then he decides to propose to her, and the way he proposes is by saying, like, this is a terrible idea because your family is awful. And she, to her credit, excoriates him and sends him on his way. But then she realizes, like, well, deep down, he's secretly nice. Now, to be fair, he did, like, some nice things, and she found out that he was really nice to his sister and blah, blah, blah. But most of us, we see this image of this story, and we're like, oh, well, he seemed like a jerk, but he was nice to her. And so, like, he must have just not really been a jerk. No, that's not actually what that is, right? If he's not nice to the waiter, he's not a nice guy. If he's not nice to his mother, he's really not a nice guy, right? The way that he treats his mother, and ladies, the way that he treats you. I know more girls who date guys who are actually abusive because they didn't mean it. You're a daughter of the King. You are precious, you are beautiful, you are loved. You're the pinnacle of creation. Why are you throwing yourself away on someone who doesn't want you to be a saint? I mean, I know men who sacrifice for their wives, who sacrifice for their girlfriends. I know a guy who, starting when he was 17, fasted on bread and water every Wednesday and Friday for his wife. He didn't know her yet, but he figured he would eventually. I know a guy whose wife was feeling overwhelmed living in the city, so they moved out to the suburbs, and he got up at 4 o'clock every morning so that he could commute into the city, work a full day, commute back, and then when he walked in the door, his knees hit the floor playing with his children. Even though he'd already been out of the house for 14 hours. And he said to her, you go lie down for a little while. I'll bathe the kids. I'll get them ready for bed. Every day. This is the kind of love you were made for. You were made for a kind of love that is the cross, right? Ephesians 5, which a lot of people don't like Ephesians 5, right? Ephesians 5, wives, be obedient to your husband. And everybody starts screaming, and you're like, baby, just finish the sentence. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved his church and gave himself over for her. Wives, be obedient to your husbands. Husbands, be crucified for your wives. I kind of feel like we got the better end of that deal, right? I don't know. But I'll be honest, I know men who are regularly crucified for love of their wives, for love of women in general. I have a guy friend, a kid I taught actually. He was engaged, and he went on Facebook and he was like, ladies, if you feel used, if you feel abused, if you feel like men are just trying to take advantage of you, I would love to explain natural family planning to you. This is a 21-year-old engineer. Okay, this guy was not made with the social skills to like reach out to people and be like, let me explain to you why you were made for chastity and virtue and purity and how, like, I mean, incredible. He said, please reach out to me. I would love to tell you what you're worth. And I would love to tell you how you can live a life that's free of the deadly chemicals and of the use and the fear that using contraception is going to bring to you. Like, these guys are out there, and I don't need to tell you because you work with them. Right? You work with men like this. Handful of you are dating men like this. Men who realize that their job is to be crucified for love of you. And I think, like we talk about God's a king and he's our father, so that makes us princesses, right? Hey, princesses, so fun. But I've known so many beautiful, incredible, amazing women who are princesses. And they're up there in their tower being beautiful and being loved, and nobody comes. And nobody comes. And nobody comes. And I'm not saying you need someone to save you from your tower, ladies, right? Like, that's not the point. But the point is, here are these women, they're waiting for a man, and they're not getting anybody who's willing to climb up the tower. So they look out the window and they're like, ooh, that pig farmer looks like he might clean up good. I said this one time in a crowd, and this girl was like, my family's pig farmers. And I was like, sorry, just an analogy. But here's this pig boy, like, in the muck, covered with pig slop, right? Disgusting. And she's like, he might be cute. So you tie your sheets together, and you, like, rappel down the edge of your tower, and you get to this guy, and you're like, hey, and he's like, want to make out? And you're like, well, I already came all the way down here, so I guess so. Here's the thing. If you stay in your tower, either he cleans his filthy self up, learns how to fight, slays a dragon, climbs a tower, and joins you, or, praise the Lord, you're not dealing with that pig boy, right? But so many of us were like, well, he thinks I'm pretty, so that's fine. You were made for more than that. You were made for a man who is going to call you to holiness, right? Who's going to ask you, like, how's your prayer life doing? I mean, have you had a boyfriend who says things like that? How's your prayer life going? Date that kind of guy, because they're out there. You guys know this more than most. I talk to a lot of girls, and they're like, guys like that don't exist. But you guys know that they do. Maybe not the particular one that you want, right? That's not my point. But you know that it's possible. That there are men who are striving to be saints. Guys who will gladly lay down their life for you. Hold out for that. Ask yourself, is this man going to be canonized? Because if you don't think he's got a shot, why do you want him to be the person your children imitate? I have a personal rule that if I don't feel a little bit bad that I'd be stealing him from the priesthood, I just don't bother. Right? Because a guy who's going to make a great priest is also going to make a great husband and father. And they're out there. If you're willing to say, this is what I'm worth. I don't need to date some random guy just because he wants to make out with me at a party. Okay? Date a guy who's going to use the word date. Going to actually ask you on a date. And personal opinion, okay? Take this with a fistful of salt. You can completely disregard this if you want to. My personal opinion is that things work better when girls don't ask guys out. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is because women need to know that we're worth fighting for, that we're worth choosing, that we weren't just low-hanging fruit who a guy was like, okay, well, I guess if you're around, fine. And men need to know that they have what it takes to win a woman's heart, and they need to be in pursuit of a woman so that they continue trying. Because, ladies, we're hard to deal with. We are. Like, who was I? I was talking to someone today, and I said, boys are idiots, but girls are lunatics. So, like, it's just, the whole thing's a disaster. We're hard to deal with. We're hard to understand. We don't use our words, right? This is a problem that women have. I was talking to another guy today, and he was like, she just like wouldn't even like tell me when she was upset. And I was like, I mean, to be fair, it's really hard for girls to do that, right? Like to use our words to explain when we're upset. Women, we have a tendency not to express ourselves, which is funny because we like never stop talking, right? But you know how big difference between men and women. So like, if Emma walks in the back of theology class, and we haven't started yet, and I look at her, I can like raise an eyebrow, and if she goes, and I go, and she goes, and I go, and she goes, and I go, and she goes. What just happened is I said, how are you doing? And she was like, I'm okay. And I was like, wait, is something wrong? And she was like, yeah, kind of. And I said, was it him? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, do you want to go talk? And she was like, no, not now. Right? And like, right? I mean, we all pretty much picked up on that. You didn't know like the exact specifics, but we understand that. I said that one time to a group of guys, and this guy was like, girls have ESP? And I was like, no, we just communicate without using words. It's actually something that women, like biologically, we're more capable of understanding facial expressions, which makes sense because we were designed to raise babies, and babies are nonverbal. And so we need to be able to tell, are you screaming because you got bit by a tarantula? Are you screaming because you're two? And that's just what they do, So we develop this ability to understand each other's facial expressions and to hear nuance in language that men have to have trained into them. So if Juliet comes up to me and she's like, hey Meg, how you doing? I'm like, fine. Every woman on the planet knows that fine means I'm actually really struggling right now, and I'd really like to talk about it, but it's not super urgent, so if it's not really convenient for you right now, we really don't need to talk about it, but if you could make time for me later, I would really appreciate it if we could work through this a little bit. Right? Right? We all know that. And so, when somebody asks how you're doing, you feel like you have to say, fine, if you really want to talk about something. Because otherwise you're being needy, right? You're being demanding. And so we don't use words with each other because we understand each other, and then we don't use words with men and they don't get it, right? Because they don't know all of our secret hidden rules. So that there's already an imbalance in these relationships. If you are the one who goes out and you start the relationship, cool, girl power, whatever. I've asked a bunch of guys out in my younger days before I decided that it was really bad for me. No judgment. You do that, he says yes, he hasn't put forth any effort to win you. And so when you're distant because you're a girl and you're having feelings, which may or may not be rational, but they're still feelings and he has to deal with those, well, he never had to fight for you, so why would he fight now? Right? So that's one reason, that women need to we need to know we're worth pursuing, and men need to learn how to fight for us. The other reason is this: we do a lot of analyzing. Right? We talked about this a little bit earlier, right? This, like, oh, he said he was hungry. Does that mean that he's hungry or that he wants to go out with me? And like, if he wants to go out with me, like, should I say yes, or should I say that I'm not hungry because I want to seem dainty, or like maybe I'll go out and order a salad, or like, oh, I know that guys are like into strong women, so like maybe I should order something else, but he hasn't actually asked me yet because maybe he's not really interested in me, but like I didn't say that I was hungry, so I should say I'm hungry too. But then if he doesn't say we should go get something, then it's probably because he's not interested in me, or maybe he thinks that I'm unfeminine because you're like, whoa, girl. Right? Not to treat you like you're a horse, but like, back up a hot second here. If you decide, I don't ask men out, I will go out with a guy who asks me out, then you meet a guy and he's really cute, and you start to think like maybe he's interested, and you're like, okay, well he did say this thing, and then you're like, but it doesn't matter, right? Maybe he likes me, maybe he doesn't. If he likes me and he asks me on a date, awesome. If he likes me and he doesn't ask me on a date, woo, dodge that bullet. That's a passive person who I don't want to spend the rest of my life with. If he doesn't like me, he doesn't ask me on a date, there's no confusion here. right? And so every time you get way ahead of yourself and you're sitting there at Mass and you look over and it's 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday and there's a guy without a wedding ring on and you're like, ooh, he's at 9 a.m. Mass on a Tuesday, but it's July, so that probably means that he's a teacher, so he has summers off, which is going to be super great when we homeschool our kids because we can travel. And then you're like, whoa, girl, you have not even made eye contact with this man. What are you doing? But you stop yourself and you're like, well, what were you going to do about it? Nothing, right? We're going to let men be men. And my policy, I don't ask guys on dates because I know that I need to be pursued and I know I need not to obsess and overanalyze everything. I need a man who's going to have the courage to use the word date. But what about those of you who are like 15? Personal opinion. Grain of salt. Don't date in high school. Just don't date in high school. It's so much drama. It's so much risk. Right? Both to your chastity and to your relationships, your other friendships. I mean, raise your hand if you have a girlfriend who was super tight with you until she got a boyfriend and then she disappeared and it broke your heart. Right? Raise your hand if you were that girl. Anybody? Okay, we got a handful of those too. Yes, honesty. I love that. It is possible that this relationship is going to go the distance. Here's the thing. Every single dating relationship you have ends in one of two ways, marriage or heartbreak. So if there's a guy who you're like maybe kind of into, but you could never marry him, then don't bother because all you're doing is asking to get your heart broken. And if it's only going to end in marriage or heartbreak, okay, you're 15 years old. You're like, no, I really think this guy's the one. So you're going to date him for 7 years. And that sounds like a good idea. Maybe it'll go great for you. Maybe you'll be super chaste. Maybe you'll be super holy. Maybe you're going to get married in the end. Here's the thing. Even if you do, you formed your relationship and the patterns in your relationship when you were 15 years old. Which means you're going to spend years fighting to rebuild your habits so that you don't treat each other the way 15-year-olds. I mean, I apologize to those of you who are 15, but we do all recognize that we at least don't want to be treated the way 15-year-old boys treat us, right? Yeah, everybody's on the same page there. I know couples who have beautiful marriages, who met in high school, dated in high school, dated all through college, got married afterwards, and they may not regret a thing, but I know that they have had to work against the patterns that they set themselves in high school. What if you meet a guy who's perfect for you, and you say to him, you know what, I think I really don't want to date in high school. Can we just be friends for now? And he's like, no, I only want to date you. Then, like, you dodged a bullet, right? And if he's like, cool, yeah, let's be friends, and you spend the next 2 years being really good friends, and then you start dating, what exactly did you lose? You lost drama and temptation, and you gained 2 years of solid friendship in order to build your relationship on. I think that sounds like a win. See, I tell this to people all the time. People don't listen to me because, you got to make your own mistakes. But I talked to a girl once, and I was telling her, like, oh, I'm giving this retreat, and, I just told the girl's personal opinion, don't date in high school. And I've known this girl since she was 13 years old. And I had led her 8th grade confirmation retreat. And she said, you've been giving that advice for 15 years? And I said, have I? And she said, yeah, you told us that on my 8th grade retreat. I said, really? She said, yeah. I said, well, did you listen? She said, I did, actually. And she was sitting next to her husband. And he looked me in the eyes and he said, thank you. Thank you for protecting my wife before I could. And I was like, it's so beautiful. Look, you make your own choices, right? Like, this is not doctrine. The church doesn't speak on this. But I think there are a number of us in this room who would say, yeah, I wish somebody had sat me down when I was in high school and said, just don't bother. Those of you who are in college or, like, kind of disregard my previous advice, which is your right. People ask a lot, what about dating guys who aren't Catholic? We're in the realm of personal opinion here. If he's not crazy mad in love with Jesus Christ, don't bother. Because he's not going to try and make you a saint. and he's not trying to become a saint himself, and he's not particularly concerned with raising kids who are saints. I think you're better off with a Protestant who really loves Jesus than with a Catholic who mostly shows up on Sundays. But I will tell you, I spend a lot of time with crying women who are married to really good Protestant men who say, I never thought it would be this hard. I never thought it would be this hard to have a divided house. And they say, oh, well, he says he'll come to church with me. Well, yeah, he'll come to church with you. But when your kid is like, the Catholic Church is stupid, and he's like, listen to your mother, it can be done. It can be done. But you and I, my loves, are not looking to just survive this life. We're looking for halos. And if you're looking for a man who's going to give you a halo, your best bet is a man who's going to be standing next to you wearing one himself. Your second best bet is someone really terrible. But I don't recommend that because it can so easily go so badly wrong. If you're not yet old enough to get married, maybe you shouldn't be dating. But it's less of a concern to me if a guy's not Catholic, because if he hasn't been exposed to much about the Catholic Church, there's a lot of room for people to change if he already crazy loves Jesus. But if he doesn't love Jesus and you're like, but it's okay, like, I'll teach him. What you're doing is you're setting yourself in patterns. That, like, I am going to be the spiritual one, and he's going to come along because he's trying to make me happy. I have a friend, married a guy. He was awesome, really funny. He wasn't Catholic, but he was like, yeah, like, no, that sounds great. I can be Catholic. Went through RCIA, got baptized, became a Catholic. They got married. He did not go to church again. And he wasn't lying to her. He really was just like, yeah, I'm going to try this. And he tried it, and it didn't really work out for him. So now she spends the rest of her life married to a pagan. I'm not exaggerating. Like, his family practices ancestor worship. Like, he's literally a pagan. But if he's the one who's running after Jesus, and he's the one leading, there's a balance there, because women tend to be more spiritual anyway. We tend to be more introspective. We tend to be more relational. So it's very natural for us to take over. But when women take over, it becomes a women's thing, and then we're nagging all the time, and it just... I mean, how many of us have seen this, maybe not in your parents specifically, you don't want to rat them out, but seen this in married couples, where the woman is the one who's, like, really fighting for holiness, and the guy's, like, maybe being dragged along. Actually, I would say most of you, I think that is the story of your parents, because I think most of you have talked to me about your parents and how your mom goes to church and your dad doesn't, or your dad just comes along but doesn't like it, or whatever. You don't need that, because there's holy men out there. I just want to open it up to questions from there. Those are my, like, initial thoughts on dating. You can ask about the Mary stuff too, but I promised people that I was going to talk about boys tonight. So questions on dating, on discernment, on praying with guys, on having guy friends.